Thank you for viewing this recorded Reliable Automatic Sprinkler Company webinar. Should you have any questions regarding this presentation, please feel free to contact Reliable Technical Services at 800-557-2726 or email us at techserve@reliablesprinkler.com. For upcoming webcasts and an archive of past webcasts, please visit reliablesprinkler.com/webcasts. Once again, thank you and enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everyone, and greetings from beautiful upstate South Carolina. Quick weather report. Bright blue skies, 52 degrees here today. Welcome to our now monthly webinar. For future reference, set a reminder on your calendars for the third Wednesday of every month as we do what we can to help you keep you and your team current on various industry topics. If you have an idea for a future webinar, please pass that along either in the chat window or email it to techserve@reliablesprinkler.com. We would appreciate that. In today's presentation, we're going to look at the most recent edition of FM Datasheet 8-9, along with changes that have been proposed for the 2022 edition of NFPA 13 that, when applicable, will have a significant impact on the protection of racks. Always important to note that the opinions expressed and the material presented represents the understanding of Reliable, and more specifically me, and may not represent the views of NFPA or Factory Mutual. Let's start with our goal. Our main goal is to become aware of conditions that define when in-rack sprinkler system designs must be classified as solid shelf, even though a solid shelf in the strict term may not exist. If we remember back to 2010 edition of NFPA 13, and this it may or may not be important, but just information to recall, back in 2010, it was determined and added to the standard that loads or pallets that block the required flue spaces may be defined as solid shelves, even if the rack is otherwise considered open. But the rules around the size and the maintenance of those flue spaces was a little bit nebulous. And that is, in essence, is what's being cleaned up in NFPA and the FM world. So where do we want to start here? Let's start with I get a set of plans for a storage occupancy. And what are we trying to do? We're going to do an analysis of this storage occupancy, and our analysis is designed to establish 4 basic criteria. Number 1, a reasonable estimate of the flow required. Number 2, the pressure at which that flow needs to be provided to us. Number 3, the duration, how long will the flow need to last? And then number 4, and more germane to today's presentation, if it's got rack storage, are in-rack sprinklers necessary? That's where we're going to start our look into our storage occupancy. Once we get to the point where we have decided that racks are necessary, then we're going to get into the details of what that rack system looks like. As we move along here, the most prominent change to the rack protection that we're going to be dealing with today is in the multiple row rack world, but there are some impacts to single and double row racks as well. So what I would like to do is a quick review of the definitions of the 3 types of racks. Single row, pretty simple, right? Fairly straightforward. It's a rack with no longitudinal flue. Generally, we see these up against the wall at the exterior walls, but they can exist out in the main area as well. The rack depth is limited to a maximum of 6 feet. And then NFPA is going to define an aisle as a minimum of 3.5 feet, whereas FM would say it's a minimum of 2 feet. I always kind of look at the distinction between an aisle and a flue as whether or not I can run pipe through it. Right? If I can't run pipe through it, that generally means there's going to be material handling equipment or people moving through it. So in other words, it's going to be an aisle. Double row racks, again, while a longitudinal flue is common in double row racks, NFPA by definition does not require one. They could simply be backed up against each other with no longitudinal flue space. FM would tell you in the definition of a double row rack that it will have a longitudinal flue of 24-inch maximum. Maximum depth, again, defined in NFPA as 12 feet, which again is your two 6-footers back to back with no flue space. With FM, you have to do a little bit of math. At least this is my understanding again. Two 6-foot racks, again, with a maximum flue space of 24 inches would tell us that the maximum overall depth would be up to 14 feet. And then again, aisle widths at 3.5 and 2 feet respectively for NFPA and FM. Multiple row racks is essentially defined as a single rack over 12 feet deep, or single or double row racks with aisles less than 3.5 feet. The maximum depth of multiple row racks is essentially unlimited, which kind of makes you wonder why we worry about aisles. But in any case, if we're going to call them aisles, the sections or groups of racks that are separated by those aisles, the width must meet the 3.5 feet or the 2 feet that's shown. Now, I do want to throw an asterisk on the maximum depth, since as we're going to see as we move through here and get through the presentation, that is only the case if certain particular conditions are met. And that's the main change that's we're going to see happening here. So in order to understand the impact, right, of missing one of these conditions that require treatment as a solid shelf, I think it's also important to review the basic FM and NFPA requirements for in-rack sprinklers, solid shelf or otherwise, and we're going to start with FM. So FM makes horizontal spacing decisions relatively easy. They provide us two options. They provide us an every other or an every transverse flue space options. So there are 5 conditions where the every other spacing is allowed. And one of those conditions, again, since we're talking about solid shelves today, you can do an every other spacing where the solid shelves do not exceed 64 square feet and the ceiling height is 25 feet or less. So both of those conditions must apply in order to use the every other spacing. In doing the every other spacing, as you read through the requirements in NFPA, you'll see that you're going to end up in a spacing range of about 8 to 10 feet on center. 10 feet being the maximum. The every transverse flue space option is required everywhere the every other can't be used. Okay, so pretty simple. Look at the ones in the preceding section. If I'm not in that condition, I have to do the every spacing option. So again, where every other are not acceptable. If we go back to number 4 in the preceding slide, we're going to see that when our solid shelves exceed 64 square feet, we are now into an every flue space option, or where we have solid shelves and the ceiling height exceeds 25 feet, we're going to be in the every option. And the every option, when you again work through the diagrams and the language in FM 8-9, you will end up with spacing in the range of around 4 feet to a maximum of 8-foot spacing horizontally. If we then look at the vertical spacing of the sprinklers, where multiple layers are required, for open frame, it's fairly straightforward. It ranges from 25 feet for class 1 through 3 commodity, and it drops 5 feet increments to our most hazardous commodities, the uncartoned plastics, at a 10-foot maximum vertical spacing. When we transition to solid shelf, now we're out of the open rack, we're into solid shelf requirements. The vertical spacing becomes pretty easy for FM. Class 1 through 4 and carton plastics, a maximum of 15 feet vertical spacing, 4.5 meters. Any exposed plastics limited to 10 feet on center, or excuse me, 10-foot vertical increments. When we exceed the 64 square foot limit of the solid shelf or the load, every single tier. All right, pretty straightforward there. So if you take a look at just that, if we miss the fact that we have a load or a solid shelf or unmaintained flue spaces that put us over the 64 square foot limit, and we miss that simple fact in our design or in our estimate, that could easily double the sprinkler count of the in-rack sprinklers. NFPA world, what does that look like? Horizontal spacing, vertical spacing. I'm going to use the term, it's a bit more elaborate, and I'm trying to use that term to be nice. The rules may seem simple, okay? They allow us to be less than 6 feet on center, our common limit for cold solder or impingement. We can be a maximum of 8 feet for rubber tires. Now, I'm pulling this information out of the 2019. It may seem a little bit helter-skelter, but this is the way they're listed in there. Maximum of 8 feet if we're storing rubber tires. And then a maximum of 10 feet on center for class 1 through 4 and basically all group A plastics. Seemingly very simple until you read this. Unless specified elsewhere in the standard. Not unless specified elsewhere in this section, unless specified elsewhere in this standard. That's pretty wide open. So it's a convenient way for NFPA to add things and bury things. Hate to use that term, but do be aware that you cannot stop here. You've got to make sure that you go through all of those other sections and make sure there's not a charging statement that overrides these very simple ones in the beginning here. In the solid shelf world, remember the rules preceding were for open racks. In the solid shelf world, there's not a lot of room for misinterpretation here, right? Either 10 feet on center for class 1 through 4, group A plastics, a maximum of 5 feet on center, regardless of shelf size. The vertical spacing, NFPA world, in open frame racks. You know, basically straightforward. If I have one level of sprinklers, I'm going to put them at or above the halfway point of the storage. If I have more than one level, if I have 2 levels, I'm going to be at or above the 1/3 and 2/3 points of the storage. So again, seemingly very simple until you read this, where not shown elsewhere on a figure. All right, so what is that? Basically, when you exceed 25 foot in height, you will be putting in rack sprinklers. So where not shown elsewhere on a figure essentially says, hey, once I'm over 25 feet, NFPA is going to give me a figure to look at and base my layout on. So does anyone care to guess how many figures there might be? So I counted them up, and then I lost count and started again and recounted. There are no less than 48 figures that you could possibly look at if you don't meet the criteria above, if you're over that 25 feet. 48 opportunities to be right or wrong. So I made a note here, if for no other reason, this might be a good reason to thank your favorite FM representative the next time you see him or her, because they have, FM has made this a little bit simpler for us than NFPA has. So vertical spacing, when we're in the solid shelf world, again, defined by 20 to 64 square foot racks or larger than 64, loads or solid shelves or more than 64 feet. And also dependent upon the roof protection scheme. So it gets a little bit squirrely here, but not too bad. If we have CMDA protection at the roof, and we have the smaller shelves less than 64 square feet, the vertical spacing is not required at every level, but it is limited to a maximum of 6 feet. I suspect in a lot of cases in the real world that means every level, but just be aware that it's every other in the smaller shelf world, no more than 6 feet vertical spacing between tiers of sprinklers. Once we're over the 64 square foot limit, every level. Pretty straightforward. So you got a couple options there in the CMDA world. When we get into the vertical spacing for CMSA roof protection and ESFR roof protection, solid shelves of any size, small ones, large ones, protection at every tier level. So a little bit of a question here. If ESFR and CMSA are considered or perceived as better fire protection, and I do want to be a little bit careful because any approved system, including CMDA, is deemed by the standard to provide the same minimum level of protection. But if we think that CMSA and ESFR might be better fire protection, why do we see no benefit when they're used with solid shelves, right? Sprinklers at every tier level. And the reason kind of goes to the root of the presentation. A shielded fire is going to grow horizontally regardless of what sprinkler is above it. It's a fire. It doesn't know if it's ESFR or CMDA or CMSA. And the water that comes out of those upper fire sprinklers that can't reach the fire because it's shielded has no idea what kind of sprinkler it came from. So that is why in-rack sprinklers are the only solution to the solid shelf problem. So I'm not showing you anything that you shouldn't already know. Longitudinal flue spaces perpendicular to the direction of loading, transverse flue spaces parallel to the direction of loading. So we've now gone through our occupancy analysis. We think we've dialed in our rack system, and there's a but here, right? And I'm guilty of this. I remember not doing this. How often do we ask our customer, how wide will your flue spaces be and how well will they be maintained? And that brings us to the reason that we're really here. Factory Mutual has already, and NFPA is in the process of, defining flue space conditions where racks without solid shelves must be protected as though they have solid shelves. So I'm going to repeat that. Currently for FM there are, and for NFPA 13 in 2022 there likely will be, flue space conditions where racks without solid shelves must be protected as though they have solid shelves. Our goal of today. And there they are. So your longitudinal and transverse flue spaces. We're going to talk about some of those conditions, but before we do, why is this so important? If you don't utilize or don't have access to the NFPA 13 handbooks, either current or past, I would strongly suggest that you get those. There is massive amount of commentary added by Matt Klaus and all of the folks that added to those documents, and they're going to give you some information that you can't otherwise get. In particular, in the case of solid shelves and flue spaces, what purposes do they serve? So they serve a number of purposes. Number one, they promote the vertical growth of the fire. We never want to have fire, but if we have fire in racks, we want it to go vertical to the sprinklers that are above it, and thereby restrict horizontal growth of the fire. Horizontal growth, bad. Vertical growth, not great, but more better than horizontal growth. And then secondly, the flue spaces provide a travel path downward for the waters from the sprinklers that will operate above. So the reason that this is important, if it's done wrong, we will have put life and property in danger. not to mention the impact it might have on your business, or it will have on your business if you have some sort of a negative incident. Also in 8-9, just as a side commentary, toward the back, they're going to give you some information about why they have the requirements they do in 8-9. There are essentially snippets of incidents where something happened to cause them to react and add information. There's some really good commentary in the back there, two in particular about unmaintained flue spaces and solid shelves that were added and different things like that. So some good reading in the back of the 8-9 document as well. So here's the information about flue spaces, and FM and NFPA are going to approach the situation a little bit different, but you're going to see that we end up in about the same spot. We're going to take a look at FM first. And I'm going to look in particular at section 2231 for flue spaces. And instead of starting at the top, I'm going to jump all the way to the bottom, number 7, 22317, which essentially says that if you do not meet the criteria in items 1 through 6 above, you will protect those racks as though they have solid shelves. Okay, here's the 6 ways to stay out of it. If you don't meet it, item number 7, treat them as solid shelves. And again, we're going to see how NFPA takes a little different route to the same spot. Here are the 6 conditions, and some of these are paraphrased for convenience. Provide 3-inch minimum transverse flue spaces at 4.5 feet on center in single row racks. Okay, pretty straightforward. 3-inch minimum transverse flue, 4.5 feet on center, single row. If I have 6-inch or greater well-maintained vertically aligned flue spaces in my single row racks, I can increase the spacing of those transverse flues up to 9 feet. So we get some benefit for well-maintained and larger flue spaces. What does that mean? If your flue spaces are not 3 inches wide, they must be treated as solid shelves. If you have 6-inch transverse flue spaces that are over 4.5 feet on center, they must be treated as solid shelves. And transverse flue spaces that are over 9 feet on center are always treated as solid shelves. And I may have misspoke. For 6-inch, less than 6-inch transverse flue spaces, over 4.5 feet on center, the middle item treat as solid shelves. So pretty easy to understand. And we're going to move on now to double row racks. So remember our definition from FM for a double row, you must have a longitudinal flue. Okay, that's part of their definition. So again, here we are at provide 3-inch transverse flue spaces at 4.5 feet maximum spacing in double row racks. And we see a little twist on the 9-foot rule. We can increase the spacing of the flues to 9 feet when we have those well-maintained 6-inch or larger transverse, and this is an and, not an or, this is an and, when we have a 6-inch or greater vertically aligned longitudinal flue space. Okay, so to go out to 9 feet, we must have the flue space 6 inches or greater, vertically aligned, well-maintained. What does that mean? Again, if the transverse flue spaces are not at least 3 inches wide, treat as solid shelves. How many times do we ask the customer how wide their flue spaces are? I don't ever remember doing it. This would be very important to know. For less than 6-inch transverse flue spaces, similar to our single row, we're going to treat those as solid shelves. For minimum 6-inch transverse flue spaces that exceed 4.5 feet, without the longitudinal flue space, treat those as solid shelves. And for transverse flue spaces that exceed 9 feet, treat as solid shelves. The third condition. Okay, we were just reminded a minute ago that the definition for double row racks states that a longitudinal flue space is required We saw some leniency for well-maintained flue spaces and the allowance to go out to 9-foot spacing. And then we get thrown a little bit of an exception here. Longitudinal flue spaces are not required in the double row racks when the transverse flues are 6 inches wide and do not exceed 4.5 feet on center. Okay, again, 6 inches wide, no more than 4.5 feet on center. The longitudinal flue in that double row rack can go away. What does that mean in kind of reverse language? If we don't have a longitudinal flue space and our transverse flues are not 6 inches wide, we're going to treat them as solid shelves. If no longitudinal flue space is present, anytime the transverse flue spaces exceed 4.5 feet on center, we're going to treat those as solid shelves. 22314, our fourth condition, now moving into multiple row racks. In multiple row racks, pretty straightforward. Maintain 6-inch wide, not 3-inch, 6-inch wide vertically aligned longitudinal and transverse flue spaces at 5 feet on center throughout the height of the rack. Pretty straightforward. 5 feet on center, 5-foot cubes, 6 inches wide, vertically aligned, well-maintained flue spaces. Away you go. What does that mean? If those flues are not 6 inches wide, we've got to treat them as solid shelves. If the flue spaces exceed 5 feet on center, treat them as solid shelves. 22315 is going to provide a slight exception to the previous rule. And what it's going to say is for multiple racks that do not meet the 5-foot cubes previously outlined, we still must provide the 6-inch wide transverse flue spaces a maximum of 5 feet horizontally. So right off the bat here for multiple row, you can see we always must have 5-foot increments, transverse flues, 6 inches wide. If we don't have that right off the bat, we're at solid shelves. Now, in order to meet the second part of this, again, transverse flues every 5 feet horizontally, and the depth of the rack is then limited to 20 feet, as defined by FM utilizing an 8-foot wide aisle. Okay, so two things there. If you don't meet either one of those, you're into solid shelves. Transverse flues that are not 6 inches wide, solid shelves. Transverse flues that exceed 5 feet on center, solid shelves. When the total rack depth exceeds 20 feet, or when the aisles are less than 8 feet, solid shelves. And then 22316, kind of a slight catch-all here, but in those cases where you might have a bagged type of commodity or something that doesn't hold its shape, 22316 essentially says to arrange those or contain them somehow. This might be some fencing up the sides or whatever it is, to ensure that they don't flop over, so to speak, into the flue spaces. If you can't do that, or if that's not done, we must then treat those racks as solid shelves. What is NFPA looking at doing? Now remember, the rules in FM that we just went through exist today. They exist today. If you're doing an FM job, you would want to certainly be looking at those. We understand, like most of you do, that something that's proposed for 2022 very likely will get in there. There's a slight chance through the process that it would get changed. If it does get added into the 2022, we understand it may be years before it's adopted, but that doesn't prohibit you, nor should it, from being educated on the subject. So this is what is looking to happen in 2022. The references that you see because this is out of the second draft of the committee process, may be close, but may not be exactly to what is in the 2019. That's all part and parcel of the renumbering scheme that often takes place here. So as I mentioned, NFPA is going to take a slightly different route to the same destination. And they're going to tell us that unless the requirements of the subsequent sections are met, double row racks without solid shelves shall be considered racks with solid shelves where you do not have longitudinal flue spaces. Okay, so remember the definition said you don't have to have a longitudinal flue space for a double row rack in NFPA world. What they're telling you here is if you don't have that longitudinal flue space, then that double row rack needs to be considered, that open rack, seemingly open rack, needs to be considered a rack with solid shelves. So right off the bat, they give us the charging statement. And then as the standards language writers committee is often want to do, we're immediately provided an exception to that. This is just, again, the kind of the way that that standards work. Double row racks without solid shelves, and this, in my opinion, should have said and without a longitudinal flue space, but it's my understanding that is the intent, without shelves, without flue space, can be or shall be considered open racks where the following two conditions apply, right? The height of the storage does not exceed 25 feet, and transverse flue spaces are provided at maximum 5-foot intervals. So we were just told that if you don't have a longitudinal flue space, you treat them as solid shelves. We're now told that, well, wait a second, you can leave that longitudinal flue space out as long as you don't exceed 25 feet and you provide the necessary transverse flue spaces at 5 feet on center. So what does that mean? Right, double row racks with no longitudinal flue space will be sprinklered as solid shelf. Again, with no longitudinal flue space, will be sprinklered as solid shelf unless we're limited to 20 feet, 25 feet, and we provide the transverse flue spaces at no more than 5-foot spacing. Both conditions must apply in order to be treated as an open rack. What about multiple row racks? Right, so remember our goal at the outset here was to identify conditions where racks without solid shelves must be considered as racks with solid shelves. So not a lot of room for interpretation in the proposed language in 2022. Unless the requirements below are met, multiple row racks without solid shelves shall be considered racks with solid shelves. Same language we saw for double row. And similar to what we saw with double row, we immediately see the exceptions. So what are the exceptions? When can I still look at them and consider them as open racks? We can do exactly what FM said. Transverse and longitudinal flue spaces at 5-foot cubes can be considered open racks. So again, we're ending up in the same essential land, so to speak, as FM with this language in NFPA. 5-foot cubes, transverse, longitudinal, can be considered open frame. What about the next language? Okay, the next exception, quote unquote exception. We see we end up right essentially where FM landed as well. Multiple row racks without solid shelves can be considered as such, open racks. Where transverse flue spaces are provided at maximum 5-foot intervals. So again, no option for deleting transverse flue spaces, none. They always must be there at a maximum 5-foot intervals. And again, similar to FM, the rack depth cannot exceed 20 feet. The only difference between us, NFPA, us, that was a strange slip. The only difference between NFPA and FM is the aisle width, the requisite aisle width, and NFPA permits that aisle to go down to a 3.5-foot aisle, where FM is going to say, no, we're taking a little bit more conservative approach. We're going to require that separation be out to 8 feet. But we've essentially ended up in the same spot with this 20-foot limit, this 20-foot depth limit of multiple row racks that do not have a longitudinal flue space. So this being let's envision some sort of a pushback rack where as you load the either on rollers or however it's done, the pallet that's being pushed into place butts right directly up against the one behind it, and you simply keep pushing these in. There's no longitudinal flue space that's maintained or provided. That rack depth at that point is limited to 20 feet deep. If you exceed the 20 feet, or if the aisle widths come down below the 3.5-foot mark, you're going to be treating those as solid shelves. So let's just take a look again at the kind of in English understanding of this. We're going to see again, we end up right where FM is. Multiple row racks must be sprinklered as solid shelf anytime the transverse flue spacing exceeds 5 feet. Okay, pretty straightforward. If you look at it and you got 5'1" spaces, talk to your AHJ maybe, but let's say you got a 6-foot space, you're definitely into this world of treating them as solid shelves. Multiple row racks that do not have a longitudinal flue, you still have to be 5 feet on center with your transverse. We know that. Those can be sprinklered or must be sprinklered as solid shelf where the overall depth exceeds 20 feet. So again, we've got to start looking at not just the plan view. I see that there's a rack that's this deep. I know it's this tall. We really have to dial in to what those flue spaces look like, and again, how well they're going to be maintained, which brings us to this topic. So how do we monitor the flue spaces? For FM in the data sheet 8-9, we see things like, and language like, well maintained and vertically aligned. Okay, pretty, some gray there, I guess. Well maintained could be argued a little bit. Vertically aligned, a little more, strict. As well as the dimensions provided, right? Our 3 inches, our 6 inches. So again, this is what's available to the owner and to us to look at and go, okay, they need to be well maintained and vertically aligned in the FM world. NFPA has a statement essentially that says, random variations in the width of flue spaces or in their vertical alignment shall be permitted. So what does that mean? I mean, seriously, it's standards language for sure, but by leaving it somewhat open, we now have to look to an AHJ or some other type of enforcement agency to go, I think that doesn't meet the intent of random variations and things like that. So, but again, that's what's at stake here, right? We've said you're going to do this. How do we make sure you're doing it? It becomes an enforcement issue by either the insurance company or the AHJ. So what does all this mean? And we are going to finish, it looks like, a little bit early today because we're going to be through it here in just a few minutes anyway. So what does it all mean? So it may be a little bit easier if we just simply play a little game of what if, okay? So what if I miss this in my bid? I've put my price together, I've missed this in my bid. And well, it kind of depends, I guess. Did everybody miss it? Right? If everybody missed it, then at some point the issue is going to have to become illuminated. If at least one other bidder addressed it, right? Someone else said, we have to do this. Then obviously when someone starts looking at the bids themselves, right? What are the bids that came in? Wow, why is there such a discrepancy between bidder A and bidder B? The sheer magnitude of these type of mistakes would become apparent, we would hope, in the bid process, right? And at that point, you maybe get an opportunity to rebid or address the situation with your customer. I would really rather be the guy that bid it correctly the first time, right? That's where you want to be. I would rather be the guy that said, hey, I think this is necessary based on everything you've told me. What does that do? It makes you the expert. It makes someone who didn't address it less than an expert. How does that all resolve itself? There's no way to tell. But again, I would much rather be the person that understood it and was able to explain it, and then build that relationship with my customer. So what if I'm not bidding against somebody? I mean, what if it's a negotiated project and I miss it in my bid? Well, again, that gets a little bit trickier, right? Number one, it very likely is going to get exposed at some point during the process, right? And how important it is and how costly it is kind of depends on which stage the project is at. Am I discovering it during my design, right? Do I have a top-notch designer who picked up on something that maybe my salesperson didn't? Is it picked up during plan review? Right? Is the AHJ that top-notch guy who looked into this and said, "Wow, you guys missed this," right? Again, depending on where it happens is going to kind of play into how much is it going to cost me to fix it. What about if it's after it's installed? Oh my goodness! Now at that point, now we've got massive costs involved to rectify the situation. We have scheduling issues to deal with. The building maybe is on the verge of being occupied. So the probability is that you're going to lessen the overall cost and the possibility of getting compensated the sooner the error is discovered. How do we know when it's going to get discovered? We don't, right? We just don't. And then probably even more importantly, in the case of that negotiated project, is going to be your relationship with that customer. But again, that person, that developer, that customer, that general contractor, whoever it is, they're relying on you to do it right the first time. They're not going to like that surprise any more than you do. So that's why we're here. Let's keep it in mind. And we're going to talk a little bit about, how do we maybe prevent this. So then finally, there's the what if the error is never discovered. And again, let's take a look at those stories, those reports in section 3.3 of 8-9. They're called illustrative losses. At some point, this issue is going to surface, right? It's going to. And you really probably don't want to have your name or your reputation associated with a disaster like some of those listed in that document. And then even if there's no incident, someone else discovers this for some reason on an inspection or whatever, you really don't want to be in a case where you're trying to have to defend this if it's discovered in that fashion. So again, what does it all mean? It means that there could be a problem here, and the best way around it is to not have the problem. So along those lines, what can be done? What is it that we can do? Well, number one, what we're doing right now, and hopefully we always hope that what we provide you helps offset some of these potential problems, but stay educated about what's going on out there. It's very easy to be in a jurisdiction where maybe you're working in the 2013 edition or whatever it is, 2016, and you live in that world. But the reality is, at some point, you need to move into the next world. So stay involved in the processes. stay involved, get involved with the committee work if you can, but in some form or fashion, figure out a way to keep yourself and your team educated. Ask questions, okay? How often do we ask how wide those flue spaces are and how well will they be maintained? I never asked that question when I was in that position. So maybe if you use some sort of a checklist for your storage analysis or pre-bid or whatever, maybe these questions need to be asked up front. If necessary, qualify your bid. You can't get the answer. There's no time. No one wants to give you the answer. They don't understand the question. Perhaps it's time to have a statement on your bid that this price is based upon minimum 6-inch, well-maintained and vertically aligned flue spaces at no more than 5 feet on center, transverse, and longitudinal. Whatever that needs to look like, so that someone looks at it and says, huh, I wonder why that's in there. Okay, or if they don't even care to look at it later on, if the situation comes up, at least you have some hope of having documented that you knew what you needed, potentially might have needed to do, and you either couldn't get an answer or you got an answer that said you're going to do this, right? So perhaps a time to qualify your bid. Provide an alternate. Okay. Look, I know time is of the essence. A lot of times bids are getting done, jammed out, but this is a pretty major mistake to make. If you're at all concerned that it might be necessary and time permits, and the nature of the bid permits, perhaps you provide an alternate. If nothing else, it gets the discussion going, and you can simply say, look, we don't know what these flue spaces are going to look like, but if you don't maintain them in this fashion, expect to pay this much more for your fire sprinklers. When they see the numbers that are involved, it's very likely that the educated end user is going to want to dial this in and make sure they don't have a problem later on. So if you need to, give them an add alternate for the additional sprinklers. As you might expect, document any discussions that you have regarding this subject. So again, it just builds a case for essentially maybe trying to get a change order when it's discovered later on that that the flue spaces are non-existent, or the owner does not want to do what he needs to do to maintain them. Notes on your shop drawings is another place to document these for the AHJ and everyone else. I would suspect if someone doing a thorough plan review at the AHJ level saw this note, they might call you up and say, well, I see this note. Why do you have that on there? Right now, what you're doing is you're educating him, and theoretically, if everyone's more educated, the fewer problems we'll potentially have with regard to this type of issue. Now, I know the last one, and I did a little NFPA presentation that was recorded, but I will say it live now. This next one may send some listeners into atrial fib. I get it. Trust me, I get it, guys. Educate your inspectors. Okay. Your ITM guys that are going out there, looking at these buildings, walking through warehouses, if they're not pointing out the fact that the owner is doing a terribly sloppy, messy job of maintaining flue spaces, or has maybe installed solid shelves without someone knowing, all of these possibilities, and in particular regard to maintained and defined flue spaces, I know it's not necessarily a requirement of the NFPA 25 inspection, but certainly, like a lot of other issues that we face in that whole ITM world, it could not hurt, I don't think, to have a note on your report somewhere to the AHJ or to the owner that it's possible that he's created a problem for himself. And the way that's going to get pointed out, again, is by educated inspectors out there going, hey, these don't look like I think they should. Now, if an owner can prove that he's met all the requirements, that's great. Is he possibly going to kick you off the job and not invite you back to inspect his facility next year? I suspect that will happen occasionally. But the reality is, and we all know it, we've been in the building. We put our tag on that system that says, hey, everything looks good, green tag, thumbs up, all good. And we have an incident. And guess who, along with a lot of other people, are probably going to be in a courtroom trying to explain it. You had nothing to do with the design and installation. However, you were there, you looked at it, get in here and plead your case. Nobody wants to be in that position. So again, if it can be pointed out at some point during the ITM process, I think it's incumbent on us to do that. So there we are, everyone. As always, thank you on behalf of Reliable and particularly Tech Services. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to seeing you in roughly a month for our next webinar. At this point, we'll turn it over. Brandon, do we have questions?
Hey, Gary, great job. Yes, there is a few questions.
Uh-oh. What do we got?
All right. First question. Any idea if there will be a ASRS mini load storage paragraph in 2022 edition of NFPA 13 similar to FM datasheet 8-34?
I sit on a couple of the subcommittees at NFPA installation and discharge. I do not recall any potential language specific to the subject of ASRS. I think that the research that's been done has been done, by Factory Mutual, which allows them to develop the 8-34. However, I don't recall that there's going to be a section in NFPA 13 specific to ASRS.
Okay. Next question. When the standard says for solid shelves, in-rack automatic sprinklers at every tier, what about the face sprinklers? If longitudinal under every tier, then every face sprinklers other tier vertically?
So I did not get into the specific details of face sprinklers versus flue sprinklers. However, that being said, both NFPA and Factory Mutual provide the diagrams where that will be spelled out. So it nowhere in there, and I'm not saying it's not in any of these documents, but nowhere do I recall seeing that longitudinal sprinklers will be at every tier level, but face sprinklers will be at every other. I'm not saying it's not in there, but I believe sprinklers are sprinklers, and under solid shelves, if face sprinklers were required, they're going to be required at every level. There would be no reason to leave them out, in my opinion, right? We know why they're needed. It's a shielded fire, and so for that reason, I suspect that face sprinklers are going to fall under the same, the same criteria. Every tier, every other tier, whatever that number is. But again, the details of when you need them, et cetera, are going to be in the 48 diagrams that are in NFPA 13 currently, and some of the kind of related plan view and aisle view drawings that FM provides.
Okay. Do you have any tips to get warehouse owners to get 10-foot beams so that flue spaces can be provided? With 48-inch standard pallets, the 8-foot beams do not provide flue spaces.
So that's an interesting one, right? Because, well, let's face it, we live in a number of worlds in the storage arena. You have your spec warehouse where you may not have any idea whatsoever what racks are going in. And of course, at that point, you wouldn't be necessarily worried about what the requirements are for the in racks. If you see a drawing, for instance, that has gone through the development process with the owner, right? His operations people have looked at it. We've got, racks that are spaced at 8'9" on center on the uprights, et cetera, et cetera. Really, are we going to then go to that owner, that particular end user who's dialed in his rack system and say, hey, any chance you can move those out to 10? No, it's not going to happen. Right now, what you could do, as far as a tip, if you had the opportunity and an owner said, hey, is there anything, right? You got maybe it's a spec warehouse guy, or maybe it's a guy who has some flexibility and he says, is there anything I can do to, mitigate some of these situations? Sure. Instead of going 8 foot on center with your load beams, go 10 foot or with your uprights, right? If we space these out and you, Mr. Owner, then work with your operations people, your warehouse guys to maintain these flue spaces, then all of a sudden I can go from this level of protection, which may be solid shelves, to this level of protection, which may be, every third layer or whatever it is, right? So the tip is just that. I don't think we're going to have a lot of opportunity to drive the width of the pallet loads. I just don't. People set those based on what they need to do, and we react. But if someone were to ask, right, is there anything I can do? Sure, then you can get into the details like we talked about and say, hey, do this, and I don't have to do that, right? Now maybe there's another way to go about this, right? Let's look at it this way. And again, time's of the essence. Let's say I'm looking at a bid where I see rack uprights at 8 feet on center, and I know that that's driving me to protection scheme A, not scheme A out of 8-9, but maybe let's call it scheme 2, whatever. But if I looked at that and said, hey, if you widen these out to 10 feet, I can save you this much money. So what is that? We provide them a deduct alternate, perhaps, and say, look, I see that you got these at 8 feet. If there's no real reason for that, and you can live with 10 feet on center and maintain these flue spaces that are required by NFPA or FM, I can save you this much money. Money talks. Maybe that's an opportunity, and call it a tip if you want. It's a kind of a way to motivate them, perhaps, to look at something other than what they've shown on a set of drawings.
All right, so our last question for the day is, can you say what are the addition for catwalk areas?
So catwalks are addressed elsewhere in the standard. They are, and they're very particular. Some like the Iron Mountain sites and places like that. They have all been dialed in. Those are different than rack sprinklers, and I think that's made pretty clear in most of the NFPA language and probably the FM language as well, right? The sprinklers that go below catwalks are not considered in-rack sprinklers, and so you're going to find requirements where they're required, what they need to be, what the spacing is, what the calculation requirements are, but it's my understanding and my recollection in most cases that they are in separate sections of the standard. They really don't walk and talk together. And so you would have to look at it like that and say, look, again, sprinklers below catwalks are not in-rack sprinklers. So it's kind of two separate topics, two separate subjects.
And that concludes the program.
All right. Thank you, Brendan. I appreciate your monitoring questions. Again, appreciate everyone joining us. Look forward to seeing you all in a month or so. Stay safe until then,